hearing different background noise. Now, Brian, I'm not sure it's you. Are you hearing any background noise? No, I guess it was still you.
I heard the same background noise that I had heard before, where we thought it was just Brian Spann, but your audio actually sounded broken up there when you was speaking, Paul.
Oh, so I got noise too?
Not noise, just broken audio.
Your audio is breaking up.
No. I've had trouble with some conferencing systems in these headphones, so I may try turning the headphones off and see. In general, it's worse, but I can try it and see if it'll help. Let's see. There's the mute button.
It's a minute past our start time, so we can try. Paul, I see your headphones are off, or your audio isn't coming through. I can't hear you. Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, there you go.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what it is.
Okay, we can get started.
Yeah. Just a second, I gotta share.
Share your chair slides, yeah.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yep.
Okay. I think most everybody here has been to a meeting, an IETF meeting before. If you haven't ever read the note well, you better read it. It has to do with how you participate, and all kind of legal crap. We won't go into any more than that. Yeah. Welcome to where are we, Brian? Singapore?
Yeah, now we're in Bangkok.
Oh, Bangkok. Okay.
Yeah.
Hope you're enjoying the weather here.
Yes.
That's why we're at this ungodly hour. And at least for the people who live in that area, it's a good time for them. I don't think we have any of them, but so welcome to RUM. We haven't done much for quite a while. A little bit of mail discussion. We're hoping to get things going and hopefully finished before too long. We've only got one thing on the agenda, really, and just to talk about the open issues on draft IETF RUM root. And other than that, that's all we got to do today. If anybody else has something else they want to add to the agenda, it's a good time to speak up and say what it is. Go ahead, Eugene.
On one of the things that's the open issue is obviously what we've been talking about in the email thread, right? The securing
Yes.
of files.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay, I think there's nothing else. We can turn it over to Brian. You gonna
Note
push your own slides? You want me to push your slides?
no, I can push the slides. Note well.
Yeah, I mentioned it already.
I didn't hear that, but that's okay. It's a IETF meeting and subject to the
Yep.
note well rules. So
Yeah, I
there
already
we go.
mentioned it.
All right. I didn't see that. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to publish the screen. Yes. Application, Chrome tab, documentation, share. Let's see, there. Okay, so these are the two open issues that I believe we have. One is the provider control of the authorized apps, and the other is the configuration file, or how credentials for registration are kept, especially when there's more than one provider.
I'm not seeing what you're talking about on the screen.
You don't have a slide that says two known open issues? Let me look at what's going on.
No, I see a slide that says latest results.
Okay. Weird.
You've shared the Medico documentation.
Yeah, this should be, well, all right, let's try it. It should be here. All right, let's try it. Hang on one second. Go back to this. Stop sharing, publish screen. Yes. Chrome tab. There. Share. How's that?
That's better.
Okay. Wrong button. Okay. So the two issues, the first one is the provider control over unauthorized applications, and the other is the configuration file, which is how credentials for registration are kept, especially when the user has more than one provider, that is, he has two telephone numbers from two different providers, or more than one. So, starting with the first one, providers want to control over what apps get access to their infrastructure, reasonable request. In closed systems, the easy example is iOS. The way they do that is they sign code, and the system that loads programs only allows signed code to load. So they have very tight control over what apps can run. You can only run apps that come from the iOS store. We don't have a closed system. You could have one on iOS if you had an iOS app, but that's roughly it. Other than that, it's pretty open, and there's very little control that we have over what code can be loaded. So we can't use that mechanism. That's all. My only point is that mechanism won't work. The alternative that most people use for this kind of thing is what we've been calling an API key. And an API key is a string. It's a secret, and it's given to the app provider after the code is tested. And the string is sent encrypted as part of initializing the app. And only that apps that have been approved will have a valid key. Because it's sent encrypted, you can't steal a key from another program. It can be provided per provider, right? So each provider could have their own key, and the app could put the right key in. Typically, you send this as a header or a JSON object in an HTTPS transaction. That's typically how it's used. we could do that, or we could send it in a SIP header, maybe a call info header in the register operation. So both of those are possible. And the question on the floor is this an acceptable mechanism? If it is, I'm happy to write the text for it, and we can, can make sure that says what we want and all that other stuff. But I'm very happy to create the text that defines how an API key is used. I would like to have a discussion on that. Do you want it on the register or just do it with an HTTPS transaction? We can work out how all the details work. So I'd like to have some discussion now about that. Is this what providers want? Is doing it in HTTPS enough, or do you want it to be done in the SIP register? Happy to do it either way. Whatever works is fine. And are there any other questions or suggestions or whatever? So the floor is open for people. We have a small number of people who are here. If you want to use the queue, by all means do that. That's our normal process, is put yourself in the queue and we'll recognize you. Or you can just unmute and talk and it'll be all right. There's a small number of us.
Why don't you go first, Eugene?
I personally feel that using it outside of SIP would be a good option as an HTTPS transaction.
Mm-hmm.
When we actually do the register and those types of things, of course, we're in SIP, but if it's pre-SIP connection,
mm-hmm.
maybe just using the HTTPS transaction would be a good option. I'm certainly not expert in the security of things, so maybe I don't understand why putting it in the SIP header would be a better way to go. I'm not sure.
It just avoids having to do that HTTPS transaction. That's really the only thing. I prefer to do it with HTTPS only because it's kind of the normal way. You're falling down a hole that's been well smoothed out. And so if you ask me what I think we want to do, I think let's just do it with an HTTPS transaction that happens before the register. It's an authorization step that you have to do. Your register will be rejected if you don't do it. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. That would be my preference. I'd rather not go mess with SIP, but I'm happy to do that if that's what we want.
I mean, we have this configuration step.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is another place to put it. I mean, if we
right.
don't,
I mean,
otherwise, go ahead.
Yes, the second open issue is the configuration file, and then there's at least some versions of doing that it involves downloading things from a provider, and if that happens, then that's the transaction we'll use to authorize.
Yes, that kind of makes sense to me. One thing I was wondering about this has to do with the mechanism by which these things get get certified or verified or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a separate? I mean, does every implementation need to test separately with every provider and get a separate key from each provider? Or
I think that we can make that out of scope for our spec, and the providers can decide among themselves how they want to do it. We can make the mechanism work both ways, and you can have the same key for all providers. You can have independent keys. Given that the IETF is international, I don't want to bias this towards the U.S. providers and let them decide and make that stick. for everybody. So unless they all think that the right thing to do is once somebody tests and then everybody accepts that as acceptable, I think allowing it to be per provider is probably the way to write the spec.
It seems to me at least we need to know the cardinality if the RU has to keep one per provider. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, if it's part of the part, if it's part of the configuration information.
I think it's simpler than that. There's already there's already the configuration file, which is common, which is the list of available providers, right? So if you have the list of available providers, then you can have a list of keys associated with each provider and substitute the right one when you go in. So it's pretty easy to make it work per provider. But it's also complex if indeed every app vendor has to get approved by every provider separately.
I think it's just a matter of what the somebody who's building a route.
Yeah.
What do they have to build in? Do they have to build a separate mechanism for the U.S. providers, a different mechanism for if they go somewhere else?
No, I think that the way the spec could be written is that it can be per provider or it can be one, and it basically, if you're in an environment where there's only one, then there'll only be one, and if you're in an environment where there's more than one, there's one per provider, then you'll have to have a configuration of one per provider. But I think it even could be mixed, right? Provider A and B can use a common one, and provider C can have its own. I mean, as long as you allow per provider and have the notion of common, then it's just how it's set up. In fact, it's built into the code, right? Or it could be built into the code for a particular region, anyways. Can we hear from other people what they prefer to see? What do you think this ought to be? One per provider, or a key per provider, or do you think that it actually might work out to be one for a region? Anybody want to offer an opinion?
Eugene here.
Yeah.
So Jim here, since everybody else is being quiet today. Having listened to the providers for a number of years on this topic, it's not at all clear to me that provider A is going to be satisfied with provider B's testing that this is not impactful to their service. So again, it's a regulatory issue, right? Do we have an individual certifying entity that does the testing and says this works for all providers, or does each provider have to do that? Brian, to your earlier point, I think that could be locale specific, right? Just because the U.S. decides to do it one particular way doesn't mean that another country would do the same thing. So I suspect in the U.S. we would be looking at a per provider certification. It doesn't seem like the spec ought to lock you into that particular thought process.
Right. Yeah. I think I have some ideas. I want to noodle them in my head, and I'll write some text down to make it possible to be, region specific, where it could be in one region it's one way, in another region it's another way. That's fine. And do recall that if we realize, maybe not recall, but realize that if it's implemented per provider and two providers decide, oh look, we'll trust each other's keys, then that's what happens, right? You just use providers A per key with provider B, and it'll work. Any other comments? I thought I heard someone else try and get in when Jim started. Is there someone else?
No, have we looked at the possibility to use existing methods like OAuth or SAML or anything else for this? It seems like we're reinventing a
Different
solution
problem.
that's already been created.
This
Okay.
is not a authorize a user issue. This is a authorize a piece of code issue.
Yeah, but the piece of code gets a key as well in those. But yeah, we can
To the
take
extent that
on
an
the list.
API key is a key, yeah, I mean that's true, but I've never heard of someone trying to use OAuth to do that. That would involve infrastructure that would be hard to come up with in some regions, right? You're talking about putting up,
Could be.
you know,
I mean, the
identity
resource
providers.
server also gets keys in OAuth. I mean, you
Right.
apply for a key with Facebook to use Facebook.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so what?
Implementations actually get some sort of key there.
Right. So for those of you who are not following this, there's the notion of using something like OAuth, which is a single sign-on mechanism, right? So there would be some sort of identity provider, and again, you could have one per region, or you could have one per provider, and then well, I guess it'd have to be one per region in order for that to work, right? So then you get a key that you can use with the identity provider to prove to another provider that you're good. I'm not sure. How would you make that work for this app? Who do you think would run the identity provider, and how would anybody get a key from that identity provider?
Well, I mean, one thing is identity provider, the other is how you register the services. But I guess it depends. I mean, in Sweden, you get kind of public funding, you get authorized to use a service, then you go pick a service on the market. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's not many market players here, and there's
right.
public provided players as well.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe you could use your Facebook account to log in, but the providers has to get in. I don't know. You can also look at something like SAML or Ederome, where you have an account in one university, can log into all universities that provide services. Yeah.
Well,
so SAML could be another way. But
I get that, but I'm still not exactly clear how it would work. If you could sort of maybe send an email to the list describing how you think it would actually work. I'm having trouble. I mean, I kind of understand the concept, but I'm having trouble understanding the mechanics. And maybe I'm being biased by what Jim said, which is in North America, it would be hard to have a single anything. It's likely to be, you know, the per provider kind of world. Providers don't necessarily trust each other in some circumstances anyways. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The regulations require that they trust them in certain circumstances, and in other circumstances they do voluntarily, and in others they don't. So I'm not sure exactly how it would work. I kind of see the idea, but I don't see it's not clear to me how it would actually work. So if you could kind of send an email describing how it would work,
I will have a lot
helpful.
of brainstorm about that and see if I come up with something useful.
All right. It's an interesting alternative. And there's not a whole lot of difference between using SAML and using OAuth, right? I mean, and it would still, fundamentally, they would work the same way. It's just the mechanics that would be different.
SAML has a federated trust that I find very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Where you have a set of authorized identity providers.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that could be the state or a couple of states or something.
So send a message to the list so we can think about it. Yeah. But right at the moment, we'll pursue the API key as being something that's acceptable, and maybe we can have a better idea.
Another question about the API key is whether or not it's just a random string or if it's actually a token that contains some data, like we use in OpenID Connect or something. Is this a signed something by something that we can use to transport some sort of data? Just an open question. In many cases, the keys used in authentication systems actually contain some data. So
Yeah, I mean, typically an API key doesn't. Although actually what I'm
no,
in some environments it does, but it's totally invisible. Nobody actually knows that there's data in there, but the provider, the guy who generates the key, actually is keeping data in it. I don't think the spec would say that.
No, but we can keep an open mind.
Sure.
To see if that's useful in any way, shape, or form.
Sure. I mean, I built a system that effectively put the identity of the provider in the key, just because it was easier to do it there than keep a separate database.
Yeah.
It worked.
I mean, you can have time limits in the API keys and revoke.
Yeah. Sure.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. You put the time you issued the key and all kinds of other great stuff in it. It's just a string, so put some data in it, digest it, and you're done.
Yep.
Okay. Anyone else with thoughts on that? I mean, it seems like the API key is acceptable. Ali is talking about a possible alternative, so we'll let him see if he can write down how it would work and look at it as an alternative. But I'm hearing that API key will be okay. Is that true? Is there anyone who doesn't think that it would be acceptable to use an API key as the solution to this problem?
Jim wants to talk.
Go ahead, Jim.
Jim here, very quickly. Ali, you mentioned perhaps using your Facebook ID as a common mechanism for this, because then you already have the centralized infrastructure. But the Facebook ID is attached to the user, not to the device. Something to keep in mind as you write something up here is that it really does need to be tied to the device. So I just wanted to point that out. Either I'm missing something or that doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
No, I guess I missed that. But the device, you want to authenticate the implementation, not the actual hardware.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, software, but yes.
It may be a device, or it may just be a software app on a standard device.
Correct.
Yeah, but we're not looking for the MAC address. We're looking for a certain release of a certain software.
Correct. That's exactly it. It's a certain release of a certain software. That's correct.
Yep.
All right. Anyone else? So,
James is.
Go ahead, James.
James wants.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I just had an RFC that sprung to mind. I don't know that OAuth is the way we would want to go. I noticed there's a best practice RFC 8252 on OAuth for native apps. I just hadn't seen those mentioned, and I just wonder it might help us clear up the nomenclature around different types of keys and that kind of thing.
Sure.
I think OAuth.
Let Ali. Go ahead.
OAuth is a potential candidate for the basic authentication for the user. I don't know so much for the device.
Well, I mean, Ali wants to propose it for the device, so we'll figure out if he can come up with a mechanism that'll work. Any other thoughts? Okay, so we're gonna summarizing here. I just a reminder IETF process, right? We don't make decisions at meetings. We make tentative decisions and we confirm them on the list. So even if we decided full start that we're going to do the API key, we would still have to go back to the list and ask people their thoughts on it. So that's just our process. What I'm hearing at the moment is an API key is acceptable, is an acceptable answer, and we might have an alternative answer using something like OAuth or SAML. Ollie is going to go and write up how he thinks that might work, and we'll consider it. We'll do that on the list. I'll start writing text for API key once we make the decision on the list on if Ollie's idea has merit. You know, if we decide that, then probably he and I will cooperate on creating some text for that idea. Otherwise, there'll be the next version will have either the API key or if this OAuth SAML idea works out, we'll have that. So that's what I'm hearing I'm going to do as author. And so that and it's good from my point of view. This is good. We have at least a solution, and we might have two. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next item. So this is the configuration file issue. The way the current text works, it's a local file with sections for each provider, single file, sections for each provider. It currently is described as having account user ID and password in clear text in that file, and that was deemed unacceptable. I note that almost every VoIP device you have has such a file, and it does, and most of them, by the way, are in clear text, which is not a good idea, but it's there. It has a local storage of username and password, and most store the more than one provider, you know, a multi-line phone, right? So you can have all the configuration information for each of your lines on your VoIP phone in that local storage, and that's what we're replicating. That you know what a VoIP phone does. You can configure each line with, you know, where the proxy server is and what your username and password is and what your telephone number is and all the other good things that are provisionable in that configuration file. Your turn servers, all of those are in that piece of configuration. It might be a little piece of flash as opposed to a disk drive, but that is what this mechanism is supposed to replicate. So we've had lots of ideas that have been tossed around on the list, including using OpenID or SAML as a way of authenticating users and then getting configuration out of that. Or we've talked about having a local login, so the app would have a username and password that the user would put in that would unlock the configuration file. And so a lot of these ideas have been thrown around, and I'm hoping that we can have a good discussion now on what we want to do, and hopefully we'll come up with at least a tentative answer or more than, you know, at least one answer that we can start writing text on. So again, the floor is open on ideas for how we handle this configuration file.
Can we start with agreeing that the implementations that we have in SIP, when had for over 10 years, is embarrassing in the year of 2020, and we shouldn't use them as a starting point at all? The user ID passwords in clear text, MD5 authentication and stuff, we have to leave behind. I think using a setup where we have some sort of certificate enrollment, where the run device create a key pair, gets a certificate somehow, and then use that. Then we can bootstrap configurations by having encrypted configurations that encrypted with the public key of the device. And we can use the certificate for authentication in SIP, which is a really good thing. I think we just have to skip the stuff you have in the middle of the slide is how we have done it is embarrassing and shouldn't be the base on how we create new solutions.
Well, I personally am with you, Ollie, but a lot of people have a lot of code that uses all that stuff, and they're sometimes reluctant to replace it with something more modern. But if it were up to me, I would do that. Does everybody understand what Ollie is talking about here? We added the ability to use OpenID, you know, with real certificates instead of username password, instead of, you know, digest. And he's advocating using that.
Well, OpenID is one part of the puzzle, but somehow setting up a device certificate and the renewal of that, regular renewal of that certificate, I think is an important part of the puzzle. How you get that certificate is an interesting prospect, but since we have an HTTPS transaction in the beginning, we can do a lot of things, assuming we have a user interface that hangs on.
Okay, but in a standards-based environment, let's say that we did that we had an HTTP transaction, so we've got a certificate, we've done some local authentication using that certificate to create the HTTPS transaction. We've created a TLS session using that certificate, you know, mutual auth. So now what? What?
It's a chicken and egg problem because the certificate needs to be trusted by a set of providers. And how do we establish a trust in a third party by all these providers for the client certs, right?
Yeah, but again, I'm looking for standards, right? I know how to do that with OpenID because there's an RFC that does that. If I were trying to use a certificate and I wasn't trying to use OpenID, what RFC would I be referencing?
The thing is that there's a lot of ways to set up server certificates. You have ACME, you have a lot of protocols for doing that. For the client certificates, we have an old SIP RFC that is, well, it's beautiful considering those times, but it doesn't work anymore. You need to have first an agreement on a device ID, right? And is that the same? The login on a device, is that the same as the user login? It's the user login we want here, right?
Right. Well, it's register, right? It's right. Yeah. What are we using to protect the register?
And there are a lot of, I mean, you can take OAuth and start with an OAuth or SAML login that ends up in a certificate. I did that 15 years ago in the university environment. So we had a SAML login where you say, oh, I'm from this university, and I got my certificate after that, and used the client certificate to get the provisioning for my special version of Bria softphone, and then use the client cert to bootstrap it all.
I understand what you're proposing. I think that that's a lot of mechanism that would be unique to this environment, and
Not really. I mean, I can use a Microsoft Active Directory to use an OAuth 2 login to get a client cert.
If we do it with OAuth, I understand what I'm doing. I'm not arguing OAuth. I'm arguing some other mechanism using a cert. OAuth, I got.
We need an authentication mechanism, and maybe we're not at the authorization level end. We need an authentication mechanism that ends up in a client cert, and the client cert we want to be using in the SIP layer.
And you would propose to use it for what?
For
TLS?
Client authentication in SIP instead of having passwords. And you can also use the key pair and the the public key for encrypting the configuration file, so you can transport that
Yeah.
zip or
Yeah,
whatever through proxies.
All right. Let's stop between you and me and get other people to opine
Yes.
about whether or not they think this is a fruitful direction.
I think that we're missing some context here. It seems to me we need, I don't know if it's use cases or something. We need some discussion of the life cycle here, starting from we have a user, he has a relationship with a provider, he's got a Virgin device or app. You know, and maybe he has a relationship to multiple providers. How do you bootstrap up to having that device know how to use,
Yeah,
I'd say bootstrap up until it's registered to all the providers that he wants it to, and then how does it stay that way over the long term, including cases where the provider, where there's some sort of compromise of keys and things need to be revoked and reset. And there's an issue there, because if somebody's using this as a lifeline and the key's revoked in the middle of the night, you don't want it so that incoming calls can't happen.
Right. We would have to work all of that out in order to do this. I think that there are reasonable solutions for all of that, but I agree that we would have to, there'd be a bunch of text to deal with this. And Ollie has made this problem bigger, right? This slide talks about the configuration file, and he's talking about more than just the configuration file. He's talking about basic authentication for SIP. I shouldn't have used the word basic.
I started with what's in the middle of the slide with the username and password in clear text. And I said, let's remove that, and suggested alternatives to that.
Right, that's the content of the file, and you went saying, let's not have a username and password in the file. Let's use certs instead of username and password for registration.
But we still need a configuration file, right?
Indeed, and we can, if we've got a cert, then we can maintain a cert and do the startup that Paul is talking about, and handle revocation and all the other things that go along with certs. Then the cert can be used for mutual auth with TLS. The cert can be used for mutual auth with SIP. I mean, you could do that.
But you have to consider short-term certs, not long-term where you have a lot of
Acme is here to save you. So 3 months, not year, or maybe 1 month.
Or session length could be a few days, but still.
Or session days. Oh wow, you really want to make them short? Sounds good to me. Sure.
That's what we're discussing in IoT for a device, because we can't handle revocation. We have Jonathan waving.
Right.
Sorry.
Hi. So when you say, I'm not sure what certs gain you over OpenID. OpenID has the advantage that the spec is done.
Right.
Which is to say 8898.
Yes. That's what I keep. That's what I was saying.
No. I want to use the cert in the SIP layer. I want the result of the authentication to result in something I can use in SIP.
Well, that's what 8898 does. 8898 does OpenID and SIP. And so I'm not sure what the advantage of a cert is over OpenID, over an OpenID token.
Yeah, we have that document, but it's, needs to be discussed because that I put in a requirement of an encrypted token, and there's not many implementations of that, and that's why I'm hesitant to.
Yeah, I feel like the advantage in this context of specs that are done and might actually be implemented by somebody in a context that in a non-ROM context is a great advantage.
Yeah, client certificates in SIP is something we had for a long time, at least in Camelio, that I'm using quite a lot. The OpenID stuff is still waiting for a lot of implementation.
Okay, so there's this proposal to widen this whole thing out and use certs for everything. That's a change to how registration would work. It's a change to how, the whole SIP authentication process works. Is that something that we can consider? Is that reasonable to think about putting into this spec? This is like Eugene and James and Jim and those kind of guys that are in this world. Are you saying hell no, or are you saying possible?
Well, they're thinking about it. The one thing about like using the client cert is that I think it only makes it as far as the front end proxy for the server. It doesn't necessarily make it all the way to the registrar.
Well, this is kind of what Jonathan was getting to, and Ali is saying, yeah, but we've been doing this for years. So, I mean, it's doable, but as Jonathan says, there's not a lot of RFC coverage for it.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to figure out whether I should say, that's great, Ali, but nobody else wants to do it or not.
I think we can start with agreeing that the traditional username, password, digest authentication SIP is something we don't want. And now we have two alternatives. We have the token-based SIP authentication, which is very new and lacks implementations. And I kind of agree with Eugene that if you have an ingress proxy, you have to transport the client cert somewhere else. In HTTP, you do that frequently in a header. You take the client cert from the first level and you transport it in a header. We have no such documents in SIP, and I acknowledge that that is a problem if you have multiple proxies in the path.
Yeah. Still looking for more feedback of this. Is this yes, you agree, or no, you don't agree with what Ali is proposing?
I think we have to take this in step, Brian. Can we first discuss whether or not username, password, and digest authentication is something we want to have in 2020, and then look at the smorgasbord of options if we don't want to have digest authentication?
All right, we can do that. Heck, we can use our little raise hand tool. How's that? I would actually like to see some discussion before we go there. Ali is asking a sort of a fundamental question, right? The traditional way you handle authentication for SIP is basic or digest, right? And use a username or password. And he's saying
digest. We don't allow basic.
Digest. Sorry, don't allow. Sorry, I said the wrong thing. Digest. So he's saying don't do that. Do something involving certs or OAuth tokens. So he wants to make that the first question. Is that a reasonable thing to do? As he says, in 2020, we're writing a spec in 2020. Is it reasonable to say, no, we're not going to use digest. We're going to use something based on certs or OAuth tokens for SIP? This is a SIP question, not a configuration file question.
Well, let me understand. The implication then would be that when you got your configuration,
Brian, you keep asking that question. I'm trying to keep my mouth shut and let the providers weigh in here, because they're the ones who are in the most impacted.
I will shut up as soon as the provider
but
wants
they're shy
to talk.
today. So when you phrase it the way you just phrased it, it seems like the change you're looking for would require some significant logic changes to the platforms that the providers already have that would impact their existing clients that are not required to be RU compliant or a parallel development so that they could handle both what they do today and what we're proposing here.
The latter.
While
The
I
latter.
understand, Ali, what you're saying and where this is indeed the right direction to be going, I'm wondering if we should be leading that or if we should be following SIP in general when it gets there.
Well, SIP is going there.
Can't hear
That's
you,
what the
Brian.
OAuth thing did.
We lost your audio,
SIP
Brian.
is going there. I mean, we are trying to leave MD5 behind by implementing SHA 256 and 512 authentication. It's still not a good solution to have username and secrets in clear text and configuration files. Clear text has never been a good option. And we have severe security problems with those solutions because of the possibility of downgrade attacks. We have no document yet on how to migrate from MD5 in existing installations to a stronger one. And if you still have to do a migration, it's better to take the leap into 2020 and do another kind of authentication. And there's a lot of things happen in this token-based authentication area. There's a new working group in IETF that kind of works with, I think it's GNAP, that works on the successor or an alternative to OAuth 2. So token-based authentication, I think, is the way to go, or client certs, if we want to look at something existing.
We have 8 minutes left in this meeting. I would really like to hear from providers what they think about this. No one's willing to say anything.
Who
We
got?
can take it to the list.
We got Eugene and we got James.
Yeah. We can take it to the list. We're running out of time to do anything else anyways.
So what if the configuration file supported both user ID, password, and OAuth tokens?
We could do that. That's all possible.
And a slightly different topic. I was still confused here. I mean, you described this as a single configuration files. Are you imagining this is something that the end user populates?
That's traditionally how it's done. It would be cool if it wasn't that hard. Right? When you configure a VoIP phone, you do that.
But my impression is that we can't expect these users to populate a configuration file. My impression from way back when was the assumption here was that when you do that initial configuration step, you go to your provider and download the configuration file from the provider. And it was presumably set up by the user having set up his account online with the provider from a web interface.
That could be how the file is populated.
And that's fine, but that means that you can't expect that to have information for more than one provider. You're going to have to get it separately from each provider.
Right. So suppose you had a local file that had everything you want, pretty much along the lines of what the current text says, and there was a mechanism that downloaded the content of each of the provider sections from the provider.
I mean, at that point, it's just encoding, whether you talk about that as one file or multiple files. It's
Well, it's the difference between
neither
whether
here
you
nor
load it.
there.
Well, it's do you download it every time you turn your machine on, or do you download it once?
I think you download it every time you turn your machine on. The provider may want to change it. You know, like change some of the URLs or the authentication.
Okay. I mean, I think either idea is viable. It could be easy to, push the button that says download it again. But yeah, all of that's possible.
As I've been reading through it, I kind of have envisioned that this would be downloaded once, but because it's downloading data that's relevant to the specific provider, it's only going to contain the data for that provider, and therefore he gets it from that provider's website.
Yeah.
I was thinking, okay, and why not let the device store that data if it needs to be updated? It would need to have another mechanism for updating that kind of data, but perhaps that's through talking with the provider thereafter, right?
Well, it could. No, I mean, the thing that says once could get triggered by some manual action, right? So
The
you could
obvious
have a
trigger-
user interface that says do it again.
Yeah, reset.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we need some automation here. We could possibly just define a well-known URL like .wellknown/ru, where you get the basic information from each provider based on their domain name. So we have a list of domain names that we update regularly, which
Yes,
could be
we have
done
that.
automatically. And then
We
we
have that.
discover through the well-known URL the specific configuration data for that provider. Having the user press a button to download configuration files seems very old-fashioned.
Yeah, I mean, we can automate that more. I think once there is something of once a day, once a month, once a day, and once every time you log in.
It seems to me that the simple way is that a revocation and reconfig is triggered by the attempt to register with the registrar failing with a bad password.
Or something. I mean, we're in the weeds. We can work out how this works, but it's automated.
Then you fetch a new configuration and try again.
Yeah. Okay. I think we can get there. I think that's not there. There are many ways to solve that problem. I think that people who are saying, look, this should not take manual action, computers can figure this out, I think you're probably right. We can figure it out. Is the only question that remains, depending on where we go with Ollie's idea of using SAMLs or tokens or certs, is what you do with credentials, and how those are unlocked, right? How is it securely stored so that you don't have to re-enter per provider credentials every time you log in? That's the part that I want to make sure that we do right. Clear text won't work, right? That's the clear text problem, right? We can't do it that way. We have to either use tokens or something like that, or we have to have a local ID and you unlock it with that local ID or something like that.
And what does it even mean to log in? I mean, the device wants to stay connected when there's no person around. Often it does. And
yeah, but that's unless your
credentials to stay up
change.
after a power cycle too. So we're not talking about, I mean, it has to be able to bring itself up without a human there.
there's, I understand, and just what's the limit there? I mean, there are mechanisms that we can use to do that. I think that's a solvable problem. I understand, but I understand your point. You can't think of it as being a kind of regular app where if you, as you say, power boot, if it, power failed and it came back up again, incoming calls have to work. You can't wait for the user to show up, log in for incoming calls to work. You're correct. That would not be acceptable.
Brian,
Yes.
so much of the current implementations of the existing VRS providers is very much tied to and based on a login. Features,
Yes.
Call lists, contact lists. So many of those things are based on the notion of somebody having logged in.
Sure, but we're all agreeing that that's going to happen. It's a question whether you do it with username and password, or you do it with a SAML token, or you do it with an OAuth token, or you do it with a cert. All of those would unlock all of that.
Or are we discussing multiple states at the same time? We have a configuration provisioning state where we set up a device, we authorize ourselves to use an account and all that. And that's one thing. And then we bootstrap kind of a running state where we have to answer incoming calls, and that's another thing. I think we have to separate these in order to clear. The running state involves SIP and answering calls, and we have to have a persistent authentication for that.
Okay.
So we have to consider situations where we have to accept expired certificates or stuff for handling emergency calls and other things. But let's discuss two different things, because we definitely have a login state where we provision accounts and so, and we can discuss how often you do that or reasons to go back and do it when you add new additional services and stuff.
Okay, we're over time now, so we're going to have to close it out and go back to the list.
This was a good session.
Yes, I very much appreciate everybody's participation in this session. It was very helpful. Let's see how far we can get on the list on these issues. If we need an interim meeting or something else to work out one or more of these things, we can schedule that, which could be scheduled at a different time scale. But thank you all very, very much for showing up.
Thank you.
So look for list traffic and please respond. Thanks.
Now you can all go back to bed.
Yeah.
For those of you in those time zones.
Yes. Yes. Bye.
Stay safe. Bye now.
Thanks, bye.
All right.